Sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin in the most unlikely places. That afternoon, the sky was overcast, the streets were slick with rain, and the world seemed to move in hurried indifference. Cars rushed by, people shielded themselves beneath umbrellas, and the whispers of thunder warned that a storm was coming. But for one woman, the storm had already begun long before the clouds rolled in. She was exhausted, her clothes soaked, her hair clinging to her face, her breath trembling between sobs. Beneath her coat, her belly was swollen with the unmistakable curve of motherhood. Every step seemed to cost her strength she no longer had to give. Her face was marked with faint bruises, old and new, echoes of a home that had forgotten how to love. Her name was Grace. For days, Grace had been running, from pain, from fear, from a man who once swore to protect her but had become her greatest danger. She had nowhere left to go. The hospital had turned her away without insurance, the shelter was full, and she was 8 months pregnant, hungry, and weak. And then, as she stumbled down a side road, she saw it, a neon sign flickering in the mist. Iron Serpent's Motorcycle Club, members only. To any passerby, it looked like trouble. Loud bikes, leather jackets, tattooed men who didn't smile much. But to Grace, it was the only door still open. She pushed the door with trembling hands, and the chatter inside went silent. The smell of grease, smoke, and beer filled the air. Every head turned toward her, the dripping coat, the trembling lips, the frightened eyes. One man at the bar raised his brow. He was big, broad-shouldered, with gray stubble and cold eyes that had seen too much of the world. His name was Bear, the club's president. When Grace woke up, she found herself in the back room of the bar. The hum of motorcycles echoed faintly outside, and someone had draped a blanket over her. The air smelled of coffee and oil. Bear was sitting nearby, watching her with quiet concern. "You're safe here," he said in a low, rough voice. "Name's Bear. What happened to you?" Grace hesitated. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then, in trembling words, she told her story, how she'd escaped from an abusive husband, how she had nowhere left to turn, how she hadn't eaten in 2 days. The room grew heavy with emotion. These men, tattooed, rough, scarred, had seen fights, wars, and loss. But as Grace spoke, something in their eyes softened. Pain recognizes pain. One of them, Rico, stepped forward. "She's just a kid, Bear," he muttered. "She's been through hell. We can't just throw her back out there." Bear sighed, rubbing his temples. He was a man of few words, but his silence spoke volumes. For years, his club had carried a reputation of being outlaws, but deep down, they followed their own code: protect those who can't protect themselves. Grace, however, didn't trust easily. She sat in the corner, her hands over her belly, watching them with wary eyes. These men were strangers. Dangerous strangers, but for the first time in months, no one was shouting, no one was hitting, and no one was making her feel small. Rico handed her a plate of food. "Eat, you look like you haven't had a decent meal in a while." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Bear leaned forward. "Because once, someone helped me when I didn't deserve." Days turned into a week. Grace helped clean the bar, made coffee in the mornings, and in return, the bikers made sure she had food, warmth, and a bed to rest on. They became her family in an unexpected way. Rico would make her laugh with stories of his mischief, and another member, Doc, an old medic, would check her vitals and monitor her pregnancy. The Iron Serpents, once feared by the town, had become her silent guardians. But peace never lasts forever. One evening, headlights blazed through the bar's windows. The roar of a truck engine followed by screeching tires broke the calm. A man stumbled in, the kind of man whose anger filled the room before he even spoke. It was Grace's husband. His voice thundered. "Where is she? Where's my wife?" Grace froze, her hand clutching her belly. The bikers rose from their seats one by one, forming a wall between her and the man. Bear stepped forward, his tone steady as stone. "You need to leave." The man sneered, his eyes wild. "She's mine. She's carrying my child." Rico clenched his fists, but Bear raised his hand. "Not anymore. She doesn't belong to anyone. She asked for help, and she's under our protection now." The man lunged forward, but before he could take another step, Bear shoved him back with a single arm. You ever lay a hand on her again, he growled, you'll regret it. There was silence, thick and dangerous. The man's rage faltered when he saw the unity before him. These men were not police, not heroes, but they had their own brand of justice, and it was clear he would not win here. Finally, trembling with anger and defeat, the man stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Grace broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Bear placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're safe now, he said quietly. He's gone. That night, the entire club sat with her, silent and solemn. They didn't talk about revenge. They didn't boast about what they'd done. They just stayed with her, because sometimes, the greatest comfort is presence. Weeks passed, and the bar slowly returned to its usual rhythm, engines roaring, laughter echoing, stories shared over coffee instead of beer. But in the back room, life was about to begin anew. One early morning, Grace cried out in pain. It was time. Doc rushed in, followed by Bear and Rico. They turned that gritty biker bar into an impromptu delivery room. Sheets, towels, and trembling hands filled the space with frantic energy. And then, after hours of struggle, the sound that filled the room wasn't the roar of an engine or the crack of thunder. It was the soft, fragile cry of a newborn child. Grace held her baby close, tears streaming down her cheeks. The bikers, men who once knew only the language of steel and scars, stood around her in silence, awed, reverent, transformed. Bear knelt beside her. He's beautiful, he said softly. Grace looked up, smiling weakly. I don't have a name for him yet. Bear thought for a moment. How about Chance? Because everyone deserves one. Grace laughed through her tears. Chance it is. From that day forward, Grace and little Chance became part of their world. The iron serpents watched over them like guardian angels in leather jackets. They helped her find a small apartment nearby, made sure she had groceries, and fixed her car when it broke down. Word spread about what happened. The bikers who protected a pregnant woman, who became her family when the world turned its back. And slowly, the town's fear of them began to fade, replaced with quiet respect. Months later, Grace returned to the bar holding baby Chance in her arms. The men cheered, teasing and laughing, but their eyes softened when they saw the baby smile. Bear held him carefully, awkwardly, as if holding something sacred. You saved me, Grace said quietly. Bear shook his head. No, you saved us. Reminded us there's still good worth fighting for. The room grew still. The men, warriors of the road, knew the truth in his words. In helping her, they had rediscovered something they'd long buried, compassion. That night, as engines roared under a golden sunset, Grace watched them ride off, the emblem of the iron serpents glinting on their jackets. It wasn't a gang anymore, it was a brotherhood with a heart. And Grace, the woman who once walked into a biker bar begging for help, now stood taller, stronger, freer.